So start with methods. Our objectives, given the specifications for a method, write a method. Given the documentation for a method, including its signature, use the method. Give a portion of the code that can be converted to a method call and a method. Use refactoring to do the conversion. Describe the signature of a method. Describe an expression-bodied method. Explain the difference between passing an argument by value and by reference. And some of that stuff is what I'm going to end up going over on Monday. I just mainly want to show you kind of how to set up a method, break it down so you know what like a method signature is and how it works. Describe the use of optional arguments. Describe the advantages of passing arguments by name. Describe the use of a tuple as the return type of a method. In general terms, describe the way event wiring works in C#, what you'll need to do to delete an event, and how you can use one to create handler to handle 2 or more events. We've done a lot of that already with our button clicks, and then if you accidentally click on your labels one too many times, and it kind of starts wiring it up for you how to remove that without completely breaking your form. So, yeah. So the basic syntax for coding a method, and we'll always do methods like this, is it starts with the what they call the access modifier. The access modifier is this public and private up here. So when you're coding out your method, you usually have one of 2 access modifiers that you use. You'll have a private and or a public. And what these do are allows your method to be used in certain areas. So if it's private, it's going to stay in that class that you're working. So as we create these basic applications we use right now, we're just using one class. We're using this form class or whatever it is. You have your namespace. That's just kind of like your file name that you see what you're using and working out of. But with these classes right now, chapter 12 I think it is, we'll get more into the classes and how to use those. But for now we're just using one class, and that's like that form class that you see when you start setting up your file. So we have that partial class right here. So we're working in that class there. You can see this form is declared public, and we look at our button click here, and you can see it's private. That private means that it can only be used in this class here. So if you declare a method private, it's only going to be allowed to use in the class that you're working in. If you declare it public, as we create more of these classes, you can start using it in other classes. So when we did methods in JavaScript, we didn't have to worry about this public or private.
This is gonna not mean much to the first semesters, but like public, private, is it kind of like, in a way, kind of like how import-export works? In a way?
No, not really.
Okay.
Import-export, that's more for bringing it in.
Okay.
This is more for, I would say, security, more like a security kind of a thing.
Okay.
So public, it allows everything to use it. It's out there. It can be used. Private, it keeps it stuck in that class so only the class can use it. So if you don't want your method used by another class or whatever, you would call it private. Yeah, Paul.
So what's like a good example of wanting it to be public over private?
If you're using multiple classes and you need it, you have it written in one class, but you want to use it somewhere else, you can just call it public and still access it out of that class.
So like when you get the error that says like unpathed code or whatever, if it was public, would that not happen then?
It depends on how the error is. Without seeing it actually run, I couldn't say yes or no for sure, but
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of times they'll say you can't find it or whatever because it's not declared public or private, or
Okay.
usually public if it can't find it in another class. Yeah.
So last time I was looking up, and instead of private or public, it was static.
Static. We won't use static as much, but static means it's kind of like it doesn't change, it kind of stays there thing. I think one of our parts of this declares it static. I thought I saw that in one of these.
For the console apps, the main is always static.
Static, yeah, and that's because it's not going to change. It goes, that's where it starts at. That's the starting point for it. So we won't use static really much when we're writing these methods out that we're going to be writing, because like I said, we're right now just working with one class, so everything's going to be private for the most part. But when we get into classes and that, when we create a class and then call it in another class to actually run the code, a lot of these, what we're going to call getters and setters that get data for us and pass it back, a lot of those are going to be called public, so we can get the data from one class over to another to get it to work. So we'll have like a class that we're going to create, and then the class that runs the application itself. So we got to get that data over, and that's what we'll do there. So this is called the access modifier, and it has mostly two values that we're going to use, public and private. So then the next part of our method signature is that return type there. The return type is just like a data type that we've been using. So some methods will not have any kind of return statement with them. And as you see, I don't think, well, we've been using return mostly to break out of loops and stuff like that. Well, when we start writing methods, as we pass data into them and get it down in the end, you'll return a value. And that value can be used elsewhere in your code and whatnot. From the method that it's calling it, it can be returned to it. And that's what the return kind of does, is it lets that data that you calculate be passed back out to what you need it to be. So the return type is just like a data type for the most part. So you can have ints, you can have strings, you can have doubles, you can have floats, you can have decimals for your return type. But if there is no return type, we use a void. And we'll use a void to start out quite a bit in here. I think the further we get in these labs, you'll start returning some data types. I think the drawer one,
Yeah,
we
I
use
think
some.
That one used a lot.
Yeah.
I think they state specifically, like, write this method that returns this.
Yeah, and if it returns it, you know you're going to have a data type. If it doesn't have any kind of return value to it, it's going to be a void. A void just means there's nothing going to return. Send it back. And that's one of the things that I see done wrong a lot of times in this class is when you have a return type, we use void so often and everybody becomes so familiar with void that when we use it in these labs and that, people will forget when you have a return, you got to put a data type on it. So they'll keep calling it void just because they're used to setting it as a void. But when you have a return and you'll have a method name,
Put my glasses on.
you're probably familiar with this, I wouldn't too worse. So you have your code here, an if-else statement, whatnot, and at the end you'll return a value, some kind of parameter in here. You'll return it, and this data type will be what you're returning up here in this method part here. So this return type will end up being, if it's an int that you're passing in and an int that's returning, your method type will be an int.
Is that kind of
So-
like just a locked in rule? Is there any way like convert returns?
You can, but it's not worth doing. You should
Fair
just
enough.
you should just declare what it is to start out with instead of doing it. I think in Mr. G's video he does something like that. He'll do a convert to int 32. But if you just call it int to start out with, you don't have to worry about converting it or anything like that. It just gets to be a big headache for you in the long run. So we start out with what is the first part of our method signature? What's this called?
I forgot what you called it.
Access modifier.
Access modifier, yeah. So we start out with an access modifier. The next part's the return type. So we'll start it out. We'll go private since that's most of what this is. Private, private. Our access modifier, and we'll call it an int if we're going to return something. And a void if no return. And then the next thing we have is the method name. The method name is just like creating a variable. It's the identifier for the method. In our variables, we've been doing camel case, where, what's camel case?
Lowercase, uppercase.
Yeah, lowercase for the first word, uppercase for the follow-on words. With this, the method name and a identifier for a method name, we use Pascal case in this instance here. So the first part of it will be uppercase, and the second part will be uppercase. So compared to a variable where we do lowercase and then uppercase, it's the exact opposite. It's uppercase and uppercase. So one's Pascal and one is camel case. With these method names, our identifiers for the methods, it's Pascal case, capital, capital.
Is it common to name your method like upper or something?
No, it more goes with what you're trying to do, like get data value, something like that. It kind of, you want it to make sense on what the method's actually trying to do. So
Okay.
I wouldn't call it, I don't know, just superfragilistic, expialidocious. You know,
Log
that
out
doesn't
line
have to do
should
with
be log
anything.
out,
Yeah,
yeah.
something to do with what you're doing. So like in this rock, paper, scissors thing, program that we did, when I redo this one, I think I call it declare winner or something like that, and then I'll put all the code in there. So you want the method name to have something to do with what you're actually coding it to do. Makes it a lot easier to understand, makes a lot more sense when you're looking through the code. And so finally, after you declare a method name for your method, you have a parameter list. The parameter list is data that's being passed into your method, or variables passed into your method. This seems like what really confuses people the most about methods, is passing this data in. And so what you do for it is, once you have your method name, you have parentheses after the method name. I'm gonna shoot real quick. So you have your parentheses after your method name, and that's where your parameter list will go. You can have no parameters, or you can have many parameters. So it can go from 0 to many on these parameter names, or your parameter list here. If there's no parameters, you just have an empty parenthesis around it. And like a lot of these convert tos and to lowercase, the contains that we've been using, those are all methods. And you can usually tell a method because it does have parentheses behind it. The button click event that we've been coding out, that's a method. It has the parentheses behind it. It passes a couple parameters through. We don't have to worry about those parameters. But a parameter list, like I said, it can hold 0 or many parameters in it. The example here has 0 parameters in it because there's nothing in it, nothing being passed to it. But when you pass parameters into it, you have to declare the type of variable that you're going to use, or the parameter that you're going to use. So a lot of times there'll be like an int, again a string, a decimal, a float, just like we've been declaring variables and everything. And then you can pass whatever you want to in. If you look on the internet, a lot of them will use like A, B stuff. You can name it whatever you want. It's pretty much a variable. If you're getting some kind of value, you can put value on it. You can put a name, like I think the one we're using, GPA or something like that in our labs. You can call them whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. It's just getting a value into it. So we're going to say int A is a value. If you have more than one, it gets separated by a comma, and you can do like a string if you need to. a decimal. But they all have to be wrapped into parentheses, and they have to be separated by a string. And so when you have your method name, you have your, what's the first part?
Access modifier.
Access modifier. And then the next part,
Return type.
your return type. The next part,
Pascal case.
method name, and then your parameter list. So once you have that done, that's pretty much what they call your method signature. That's the way you set your method up.
What was the first one again?
This one here is
Yeah.
your access modifier, and just what allows you access. Is it
Right.
public or private?
I remember that part, I just remember the name.
Yeah, if it's public, everybody has access to it. Anything has access to it. If it's private, only that class that you're working in, declared in, that's the only one that can use it.
Makes sense.
So then once you get your method name, so we'll do private int
So that would return an integer.
This will return an integer, yep. That's the return type. So as we code this out, once you get your method signature set up, and actually, I'll put void and not return anything, just. After you have your method signature set up with your access modifier, your return type, your method name, and your parameter list, that gets followed by the squiggly brackets. Just like we've been doing for if statements, the loops and stuff like that. And then inside here is where all the body of your code goes. And so when this gets accessed, it goes, looks for the method name. Once it finds the method name, it looks for the squigglies, and anything inside those squigglies ends up getting run as code. So,
What would you prefer, void or putting like the actual variable name?
You should
well,
always
that's the
use data
thing,
type.
is you gotta have a return data
There's
type.
one, yeah.
If you're not returning anything, so if you have, and I'll show you in my example, if you're not returning anything, you use a void.
Oh, okay, makes sense.
But if I'm gonna return something, if I have a return statement down here, return value, then you have to tell it what kind of return value that is. So
Right.
if this is an integer, you have to return an int. If that's a decimal, you have to return a decimal. If it's a string, you have to return a string.
Right.
So this return value just matches up with whatever this is coming back as. So if this is, like I said, decimal, it's gotta be a decimal.
A way that helped me kind of like understand it, and this isn't in all cases, because like if the method is void, it's not returning anything. But if you're trying to get any sort of value out of data that you have collected, you basically collect that data and you're sending it through the method like a machine. It's going to output something for you to use. And so whatever you're trying to get, whatever kind of data, you want to like let it know what kind of data it needs.
And so like Matt was saying, this is what we consider input. This is getting input into our method. So you can look at these parameters as being input. This return statement is considered output. So
That
you
goes
can-
on the bottom too, right?
Yeah, it's always at the end of your code, because
Okay.
that's gonna run through your code, get your value, and return it. So with our input, you can have 0 to many inputs. You can have a list, and I've seen 30, 40 things up in these parameter lists get passed through. And this is, when you talk about this stuff is getting passed in, is what they say. So these parameters getting passed in, it's an input. You can have 0 to many of them. But when you get to the return statement, you can only have one return statement. You can have 0 or 1 return statement, and that's it. You cannot have multiple return statements in your method. If you do, you're going to have all kinds of issues. It more than likely won't compile, and you'll see a bunch of red squigglies underneath saying more than likely you have multiple returns or whatever. So
Unreachable code.
yeah, something like that. And so the input 0 to many, the output 0 or 1, and that's it. So let me bring up some code just to show you a little bit easier how it looks and runs on this actually. I'm going to use somebody's,
All of my methods on rock, paper, scissors is just void.
And that's because you're not returning anything technically. If you're returning something, yeah, then you'd have to put a return type, and I'll kind of show you how that works.
Just counting up in a method, and then I'm just returning, not returning, but displaying text.
So I'll start with your rock, paper, scissors then, since you. So that's what, lab 3?
Oh, I think it's chapter 5. Oh.
That's what I had,
chapter
yeah.
5.
So. There we go. So here's Jamisha's rock, paper, scissors. You can see there's a lot of stuff going on. We got 3 button clicks. We'll still keep all that. And you can see here, here's our class name. The namespace is just the file name that it's under. We have a method here that I've been pointing out for a while now, that initialize component. It's not passing any parameters in. That's why it's just the parentheses with nothing in it. Here they're doing a private void, and that void means it's not returning anything. It's just running. That's all right. They are passing in arguments here, or parameters. And then you can see our button click event is private because it's only being used in this class here. And it's void. It's not returning anything. She doesn't have a return statement in it anywhere. And it's passing a couple methods back, but we don't worry about this since they've already been wired up for us. It's passing an object with the name of sender and a event args with the value of E as the variable for that. That's kind of how you can look at that, but we're not too worried about that right now. You can see parameter object sender, class system event args, parameter event args E. So kind of if you hover over it, it'll tell you what it's passing through there. So what we'll do is if you look at that, there's a lot of code, a lot of the same things going on with this here. So what we're going to do is a file new, I'll create a new project. I want a Windows form. Let me stick this somewhere else. I think I got one in here already. Yeah. Desktop. Feature value. I'm just going to throw it in here. Do a new file. Rock, paper, scissors example, method example. I'll select this folder. I'll go ahead and stick it in there. I'm going to call this rock, paper, scissors method example. Keep it the same name there. We'll go ahead and create that. So I got my form, and again we got to set this up. So I need 3 buttons. We know that to start out with. Control C. And then I know I'm going to need some labels on here. So I'll put a label here for the player score. A label here for the computer score. Bless you. Another label to actually display it. Another label to display that. And then one more label to say who wins the game. So there's kind of the basic layout of the form. We've done this already once before. I'll go ahead and start getting her cleaned up. And I'll call this rock. Of course, the naming conventions, BTN rock. ITN paper. Paper. And scissors. Scissors, those are my 3 buttons. I'll do
What was that one you said display?
I just called it display player score. You can name it whatever you want.
Not like the first one, but like the one you're doing right now.
The one I'm doing right now,
Yeah, I need to picture it.
I did label display player score is the one I'm doing right now. So that label 3 I have there, I'm going to call it label display player score. And then I'm going to remove the text off of it so it's hidden. So it looks like that there. Then I'll call this label computer score. And I call it text just because I know I'm not going to be messing with it. It's just part of my text on the screen.
I think you added a semicolon, yeah.
Oh yeah, my label there. Label comp score. I was thinking I was up in the text part up here.
How many labels is it again?
5 in total.
You know, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So there's my computer score. Don't want any text on that, but I gotta give it a name. Display the computer score. And I'll just call this label game winner. Don't need anything showing on that. So there's the general layout of it all. So as you catch up on that, I'm going to go back to Jamisha's real quick. If I think I closed it. So let's open a new one up. So open, and then Jamisha's back up, as I started out using for my example. So when we create a method, we want to usually keep them outside of our button clicks and all that. We want to keep them in scope. And so what we'll do is we can put it above the button click, and it's still in our form, so it's technically in our scope. And so I'm going to create a method, and I'll do private, and you don't have to do this. I'll show you here in a minute when I go back to my example. So this is my example here.
What did you name the winner, display winner, in this one? Sorry.
That's all right. Label game winner. And like I said, you can call them anything you want. You don't have to follow my namings on here. I just throw some stuff in there. So back to Jamisha's, I am doing a private void declare winner. And so I'm starting to set up my method here. The first part, private's the what?
Access modifier.
That's right. And what choices do you have for the access modifier? Public and private. You can use static, but we're not going to use it in this.
Is there
The
any difference
Variable.
between a private and a public void?
yeah, like I said, when the private and public have nothing to do with the void. The private and public have to do with the access that's allowed to this method.
Okay, so you can theoretically do a public void.
You can do a public void, yeah, and we will end up doing those once we start creating classes, but the access modifier is just who gets access to this method.
Right.
If it's a private method, only the class that we're declaring it in can actually use it. So we're in this public form 1 or the public partial class form 1. That's the class that we're declaring it in. That's the only one it can use it in since we're declaring it private.
So you can like declare privates inside of the public and only in that public that specific space.
Yeah, and that public class can be used by other classes if need be. But we're not worried about that right now because we'll get to classes when we get to chapter 12. And that'll be the next lesson we learn after these methods is classes. So the access modifier just says who can access our method, who is allowed to use our method. If it's private, only that class we're declaring it in can use it. We can use it multiple times in that class, but only that class can use it. If we're declaring it public, as we create other classes, which we're going to do in chapter 12, other classes can use this method as we declare it.
And is that for like the purpose of like not cluttering the amount of
More for I would say like a security thing to where you don't want certain methods accessed outside the class and that, so you'll want to call them private. It's more of a security kind of a thing, I would say, just to keep them private and public separated
This is
for
like
access.
a really hypothetical, but like just off of the for security. So like say a company might have like some sort of method for like a login or something. They'd want to keep that private because they'd only want employees to be able to use it.
Well,
And-
it's not even about who uses it. It's just a class,
Okay.
that class that uses it. And so we want to restrict it to only this class. We don't want multiple classes being able to use this method. We want just this class only to use this method. So we're calling it private. That way this class is the only one that can access it. So we don't have to worry about this being used elsewhere. If it is like a login kind of a method or something like that, that way only this class can use it.
Okay.
So we have our access modifier, usually public or private. Depends on how you want to use it. Like I said, private is strictly for the class we declare it in. Public is for any class can actually access it. The next part is our what?
Variable.
No, there's a name for it.
Return type.
Return type. So this here, we're not going to return anything, so we're going to give it a return type void. But we could give it a return type of int. We could give it a return type of decimal, string, anything that we've done before with a variable name, a data type. That's what goes in here is your data type of what you want your return to be. Well, since we don't really have a return, we're going to use a void for our data type. So we have our declare winner. Give me a second here. Where'd my example go? There we go. So back to Jamisha's. So we have our declare winner. And then after our return type, we have the, what's the next part of our method signature?
Identifier.
Yeah, it's our identifier. Our method name is what the next part is. That's our identifier of what the name of this method is. And then after that, we have our parentheses, and the parentheses hold the parameter list. So I put my squigglies on, I take my squigglies away, and you can see it's not happy. It's telling me I need some stuff. Must declare a body because it's not a marked abstract. The body again is the squiggly brackets, and that's where the body of our code all goes, inside those squiggly brackets. And actually for this demo here, I am going to pass something in and return something. No, actually I'm not going to return anything, but I'll pass something in. So I'll do an int and then call it user choice. And then in Jamisha's form here, let me go out to her form. I'm going to put another label on here. I'll just call it label 1. Nah, I'm going to change it because I want data to show up in there. I'm just going to call this label example. So in here I will do .text equals.
Logging it out.
What's that?
I heard a term called like logging it out, where you like make sure it's actually reading that data.
I haven't heard it called that, but
Is that what you're doing? You're making sure it's actually like passing?
I'm just using this as an example actually. So, and I'm going to do user choice to string. And so down here in this button click, and I'll put it towards the end down here. Label example dot text equals. Oh no, that's not what I want. I want to call the method down here, so I will say declare winner. And so now what I'm doing here, and I don't have it set up right because I'm supposed to be passing a value through here, and that's why it was mad, because our method signature up here is saying we're passing a value through here, this int user choice, so we need to pass something back. And when we pass it back, the method call, when we pass a value back through it, it's called an argument. So now this declare winner down here is passing an argument with the value of 1 in it. You can put anything you want in here as long as it's an integer. So if I run this, we should see that number 1 here show up on that label I just added. So let's run this real quick. Here's Jamisha's rock, paper, scissors. I click on there, and there's my little number 1 down here that I just added. We can put any number we want to in there as long as it's an integer. So 10,001, we run this again and we should see 10,001 down there. pick rock, there's our 10,001. So what we're saying is we're calling this method on her button click. So we do the button click, we run through the code, we get to our method here. This is our method call. We're calling the method we just created, and we're passing an argument of 10,001 through here. So when we hit this method call, it goes back up to where we declare our method. It finds the name of it. It's saying we're passing an integer from the user choice in. And then it goes to our example.txt. It runs this line of code. Our user choice, what we just passed in was that 10,001. So it picks up that 10,001 and uses that as a value and puts it out to a string. So if we decide to come down here and say, let's make this a string and see what happens, what do you think is going to happen?
Not gonna like it.
No, it's not, because now we're saying this is a string. That's stupid IntelliSense. So now it's saying we're trying to pass a string, and it's not happy because it says cannot convert string to an int. So now we're trying to pass an argument of a string type up into our integer, and it's not happy. So we could do, if we want, we could do a string and call it whatever, user number. And pass it through like that if we want. And then we'd have to put our, it's not happy because we're needing an int on the front. It's got to be separated by a comma. And then we could pass it through like that. So you can see you can pass multiple data types through here. But they have to be declared the same way. So like our int has to be an int down here. Our string has to be a string up here for it to work properly. We could call this a, we put 10,001 back in here. We could call this a double if we want to up here. And as long as it's a double in there, it should still run. And it is a double. If we try and put a decimal in it, keeping it back to an integer. And it's still an int. What happens if we try and put a decimal point in here? Yeah. It's not happy because now an integer can't hold the decimal to it.
And if we were to do like a similar thing for like getting a user input, could we like use the user input as the parameters? Like put them in the parentheses instead of set number?
Yeah, so what you do is on your method, when you declare your method, whatever you want, like if you're doing a login kind of a thing and you have like a username and stuff like that, you could declare it in your method signature that you want a username passed in and you want a like a PIN number passed in kind of a thing. So you could set up a string username and then an integer called PIN, or you can make your PIN a string too if you want. And then you would just pass it in, and so like when they click the button and you have your two text boxes, like your username and PIN, you enter and you click that, enter whatever your button click event is going to name. Then it'll take that name and it'll take that PIN number from that and pass it into that variable, or pass it into that method and run through it. So it looks something like this, Kieran.
Okay.
So you'd have like something like private void, we're not gonna return anything. Get user info. And then we could do a string and call it name. And then you could, depending on how you want to declare your PIN number, you could do it a string, you can do it as an integer. I'm just going to give it an integer. And you call it PIN if you want. So this is our method signature that would set up. This is our what here, the private part is called access modifier. This is our return type. And if it's not a void, we can use a what other kind of data type? What was that, Jamisha?
Oh, my bad. That's the access modifier, my fault.
So the void, we can use an integer, we can use a decimal, we could use a string depending on what we're returning. We're not going to return anything, so we're just going to give it a void. The get user info is our method name, our identifier, and then the stuff inside the parentheses is our parameters that we're passing in. How many parameters can you have?
As many as you need.
Yeah, and what's the minimum? 0, yeah. So we can go with no parameters, or we can go with however many we need. If we want string instead of name, we can do string first name, string last name, integer PIN. We can do anything like that. Yeah, Paul.
If you have a method that's returning a value, can't you just call that method as a, or like, say you have another method other than get user info that returns something, couldn't you have that method be a parameter?
Could have that method be a parameter. You could have that method, or you could have the return type as your parameter to pull it back as an argument.
So if you have that method that returns, like say it returns whatever, like integer of 5 or something, and you pass that as a parameter, it uses that return value as a parameter.
It can use that, and actually on the desk or the drawer one like that,
yeah, that's what I did.
I did that on all mine. I called the method, called another method to get the value out of that method like that. Yep. So I think I had 4 method calls, 5 method calls at the end, and I think 3 of them I passed through another method as my parameter to get that value out of there. So yeah, you can do it like that. So we have our method signature set up, Kieran. Put our squiggly brackets in here. And then we have our Windows form. And our Windows form, we have our form. And we have a text box for a username. And then we have a text box here for our PIN number. And then we have a button like enter. And so when we do our enter, we have our button click event. And in that button click event, we'll have our method call in that button click event. So we'll do on the button click event, on our button click inside here, we'll do that get user info. And then inside this get user info, we got to get the username, and we're going to get that PIN number out of here, and we're going to pass that in through here. So we'd use username, oops, and PIN, and so this would get passed back into our method up here. So whatever they enter for that username and that PIN gets run through our code. So you can do like a validation check if name is equal to username, you can say like is valid equals true, and kind of run through it like that. And then you'd check to see if the PIN is valid, and if you have a list or whatever, you can store it in a list and walk through the list and make sure it's all legit and stuff like that. This is just kind of a brief example of.
What does is valid do though?
It's just a Boolean to say, yes, the name and the username are the exact same thing. So this is good. It's valid. Keep going through. We're not really using it yet, but as you do start doing validation and stuff like that, and you might even use it on the bank one.
I'm thinking it's valid, yeah.
Yeah, at the bank one at the end, you're just checking to make sure it's all true and they're not putting in bad data or anything like that. If they put in bad data, you can set your is valid to false.
I'm just confused as to where you would use that and what you would do for the rest of the
Which part
is valid.
is valid? It's just a check. I mean, we don't have to use is valid.
That would be a bool method, and you can just return true or return false.
Yeah, and that's what it's doing. And a lot of times in your validation, you're checking stuff like that. So it's like, is valid is true.
Welcome message.
Yeah, you can throw a message saying, welcome to the bank of Kiernan or whatever.
Okay, so like if it is true, then you can like do something.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just a little bit shorthand way of
So
setting a
it doesn't do
validation
anything on
thing.
its own. It's just another check.
Yeah, it's basically just a traditional Boolean with like its own name.
So you set, so up here you'd set like, is valid,
And you just set it to false.
false.
And so that way its default is false.
Yeah, so you know it's wrong. So it's like, okay, let's, if it goes to true, we know we're doing the right thing. So we could do an is valid as true. And set a message to say, welcome to the Bank of Kiernan. If this isn't true, and we go down to our else statement down here, yeah, you could put, you know, something's wrong, improper username, please put in the correct username, or
No user found.
yeah, something like that. If it stays, if your is valid stays false, but we're not really getting into that part right now. It's just kind of mostly showing you how to pass like a username out of your form through your button click into your method over there. Does that make sense, that part of it? And so what I see is this part where you're passing parameters in and using the parameter values. That seems what really starts to throw people off on these methods. When you're not passing anything and you're returning void, it's super easy for the most part. It's just doing something, and that's kind of what I'll show you on this demo here. But when you start passing in parameters and arguments, that's where people seem to get lost because they can't comprehend where you're getting these parameters from to pass in and start using through your code, kind of a thing. And next week when we get more into these methods and stuff like that, I'll give you some more examples of passing the parameters through and the returns and stuff like that.
So we got some that say, okay, declare winner, double number, string name. I got 2 parameters in there. If I put declare winner and give it a double, that'll work. But as soon as I go to declare winner to try to give it a string, it's all red.
Yeah, because you have to set it up properly, and
Okay.
without looking at your code closer, I couldn't tell you exactly how you have your method signature and stuff set up. But yeah, and we'll get more into that, and I'll show you just the basic one, just so you can kind of get familiar with setting up basic methods to get you going on your labs and stuff like that. So again, our declare winner is, did you figure it out?
Yeah, you just, it's a comma. You put it in the same parentheses, not on its own line.
Yes, yes. So here it's mad because we're trying to pass a double, but we're calling it an int. So if I change this to double, now our line down here should be happy since it can take a decimal.
C# so moody.
It is, isn't it? So to go back to my example here, I'll start coding this out. And I'll code it with the method in it instead of using the methods instead of without it, and then cutting it. We can flip back to Jamisha's to kind of look and see the differences. But I'm going to start with the rock. And then up here, I'm going to call my my method. This is my method declaration. I'm getting ready to declare my method. So I will call it method declaration. This is my method declaration here. I'm declaring it. Just like we declare our variables, we're declaring our method. So I'm going to say private. Since we're only using it in this class, and you can see our rock is private down here too. We'll do a void because we're not going to return anything. I'm going to call it determine winner. I am going to pass in one parameter, and that's what the user choice is going to be. And then I need my squiggly brackets. That's my body of my method. That's what runs the code that runs when I do this. So now we got to figure out what we're going to do here. Well, we need to declare a couple variables. We need our integer, our player score. Set that to 0. Our computer score. Set that to 0. And then an int round count. Set that to 0. So we have the three our variables that we're going to need in this. So to start out, again, first thing we did when we were coding these button clicks is we got to get that random number. So let's get our random number. And actually, I'm going to declare my random number up here to start out with. So there's my random number up there. I'm setting my object up there. I'm going to use it down in here. So I'll call it integer computer choice. Next, and that's 1 through 4 again, just like we did.
And so like those are the parameters for that, the rand, I guess is rand like a method?
Well, it's this random up here is a class that we're using.
Okay.
And like I said, when we get to classes and objects, we'll understand more on what this is doing, but this new means it's instantiating. It's kind of like setting it to where we can use it.
Okay.
And then one of the methods in that class is called next, and that's what we're doing here. So we declare our variable rand, and we set that rand using that class of random, and the method out of it is next. And we want our number between 1 and 3, since it starts at 1 and 4 is like the cutoff, so it's going to be between 1 and 3. And then we're going to say if user choice is equal to computer choice, what would we expect to happen?
Would be a tie.
Yep. Let me get my squigglies.
So would you just be like player score or plus equal?
I wouldn't even put a player score or anything since it's a tie. I just leave it like that.
Okay.
And so I'm going to we'll go through the logic here and kind of code out the if else statements, and then we'll put the rest of our logic in between. So we'll do our if else's first, and we'll put our logic in there as we go through. So then we want to do else if user choice equals 1, Where's my and sign? And computer choice equals 2. The computer's going to win this round because our 1 is the rock and the 2 is the paper. Paper beats rock, so the computer would technically win that. And we'll do another else if user choice equals 1. And when you use the and sign, how does that work?
They both gotta be correct.
Yeah, that's right. Both sides of that ampersands there had to be correct. So the user choice has to equal 1 and that computer choice has to equal, on this case we're going to say 3. So if we choose rock and the computer chooses scissors, user wins this round. Then we'll say else if user choice equals 2 and computer choice equals 1. The user wins. Because if we're choosing paper and he chooses rock, rock beats paper, so we would win that round. There's probably an easier way to code this if we really take our time and dig into it, but this is just kind of a way to show you how these methods work. Else if
I'm gonna be honest, I'm relieved to see that you also comment what your code is gonna be doing, because this is how I've been like setting up now.
have you?
Yeah, like so I can kind of like read like how the logic should go.
Yeah, so like we're just doing our if else statements to kind of figure out how that's going to go, and then once we kind of figure that out,
Then we can put logic.
yeah, we'll put all of our labels and everything else in, and our counters and everything else we need in here. And actually I'm going to zoom in a little bit for you guys just to make it somewhat easier to read some of this. I know it gets hard to read. So if our user choice is 2, and the computer choice is 3, scissors beats paper, so the computer's going to win this one. And then we'll get down to our last little bit and say else if user choice equals 3 and computer choice equals 1. The computer will win this. And then we'll finish it up with an else statement and say user wins. So if we look at our code, the very first thing we do is we check for ties and say if the user chooses 1 and computer chooses 1, it's a tie. If user chooses 2 and computer chooses 2, it's a tie. User chooses 3, computer chooses 3, it's a tie. Then we start going down through our comparisons. If user chooses rock, computer chooses paper, the computer will win. If user chooses rock, computer chooses scissors, the user will win. If user chooses paper and the computer chooses rock, we win. Or paper beats rock. If we choose paper and the computer chooses scissors, scissors beats paper, so the computer's going to win. If we choose scissors and the computer chooses rock, the computer will win. And the only other choice is for us to choose 3 and the computer to choose 2. Well, scissors beats paper, so we're going to win down here. That's why we only use an else statement down there, and we don't need anything else with it. So now we can go through and start putting our logic in it, or the rest of the data we need. So if it's a tie, let me see what I named my... Oh, I forgot one of my labels. So I want to put one more label on here. Sorry about that. I scoot all these down a little bit. Probably got all my stuff jacked up now, but it is what it is. So this label one here, that's what I'm going to show is what the computer is doing on it. So I don't really need anything there. I'll call it label comp selection. Go back to my form. LBL comp text. That's going to just equal it's a tie. Need our semicolon at the end. So now down here, if the computer wins, we're going to say LBL computer selection.
And the purpose of making that into a separate method is so that all three button clicks can call upon that?
Yeah, so for each button click now, instead of having to type
All of that out?
yeah, well, not quite all of it, but like, let me get, so here's our button click here for the rock. So instead of writing all this out for the rock,
Right, yeah, I remember having to write that down like 3 times.
yeah, and that's the whole purpose of using methods is code reusability. It will save you so much time of typing everything out. And like when we use these, like the 2 strings and the 2 lowercase, somebody already typed those out somewhere, and they're stored in the system data part of this program. We're just using them. Somebody already typed them out. We're just reusing them. And so instead of having to type out all the code behind a, see if I can find one in here.
I think the only part that I'm a little confused about is like parameters and a little bit on like, the details of declaring and using the methods.
So the parameters, like I said, it does seem to give everybody some confusion. Once I turn you loose on these labs here in a bit, I think the first couple, maybe the second one starts using parameters. And when you get there, I'll walk you through it then. And then Monday, when we kind of dig more into these methods, I'll do some examples on Monday. I'll have some kind of ready for you and show you how to pass these through. So let me go back to the code real quick. Why don't we take a break and I'll go ahead and continue coding some of this out just to save a little bit of time. Go ahead and take like 15-20 minute break. Be back about 1:45. And I'll code some more of this out so you don't have to sit through the boring part. So while you guys were on break, I went ahead and coded out the rest of my code here. So if we look at it, we'll say if user choice equals computer choice, it's a tie. It should show that it's a tie. If user choice is 1, which is rock, computer choice is 2, which is paper, the computer wins. So if I actually run this now, and I click on the rock, something ain't happy. So what did I do wrong? I had it all working. Oh, I know what I did. So I got my code all done. I go to run my program. I click on it and nothing happens. So I look at my button click down here. I got nothing in my button click to run. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to call, and you can see it's called but not being used, or declared but not being used. So I'm going to take this determine winner method that I just created, put it down in my button click. So I'll do determine winner, and then my parentheses for my arguments I'm going to pass back. And so in here I'm saying I need an integer, which is my user's choice, to get passed back into my method. So my argument with our user's choice, what do we have for a choice? 1, 2, or 3, 1 being rock, 2 being paper, 3 being scissors. Rock being the first one we're working on, I'm going to put my user choice as 1 in here. So now when I click on this rock button, every time this determine winner runs, every time I push the button and my determine winner runs, I'm passing this argument of value of 1 into my method. So when I push that button, since it's the only one I have programmed so far, my determine winner is going to pass in a user choice. My user choice value is going to be 1, since that's what I set my argument up down here, is passing that 1 in. So now every time I click the button, my user choice value is going to be 1. So if user choice, which is 1, equals the computer choice, whatever he chooses, it's going to go through it. So now if I run this and click on rock, there rock must have chose 1, or the computer must have chose 1, because that's all I'm passing in right now is this value 1 for this rock button. So we tied. I picked rock, he must have picked scissors, because I won this one and it gave me 1 for my score. So if user choice is 1 and computer choice is 3, which is rock versus scissors, I win. It increments my score and displays my score out to a string. So if we keep running this, computer's getting whooped. You can see that it just keeps running that determine winner method, passing that value 1 back into my method, and it's running my code for me. So now if we want to wire up the paper part of it, we'll just double click on paper. Oop, that's the actual app. We'll double click on paper, get our paper button click wired up for us. And again, what's the private here for?
Only usable in the class.
What's it called?
Access
modifier, yep. And private means what?
Only usable inside the class.
That's right, the class it's declared in. That's the only place we can use it. Void means we're not returning any kind of value for our return. Button paper, that's what we named our button, was BTN paper, and the click is the event that goes with it. And that click has a method that we're running there, but we're not worried about that. So now we got the paper. All we have to do is to copy this determine winner method, put it down in here. Well, we said rock is 1, paper is 2, so now we got to put a 2 in here. We're going to pass, when we click on paper, we're going to pass the user choice value of 2 back through our code. So now if we click paper, our user choice value is 2, since we set our integer value down here, 2 for user choice to pass back as an argument. So now every time we click on paper, our user choice value is 2, and wherever it says user choice, that's what our value is going to be for paper is 2. So now we'll drop down in here and say user choice equals 2. Yes, it's going to equal 2. And then we just got to see what the computer chooses. So let's run that again and click on paper for a couple times. So there's paper. We're going through paper. We can hit rock if we want to because we've already programmed rock out. Now if we click scissors, nothing's going to happen on scissors because we haven't programmed for scissors yet. So now we want to program scissors in here. We'll double click on scissors, get that button wired up. Again, we can just take this determine winner because that's the method we're using for all this. Control C, Control V, and again we said scissors value is 3. We go back to our code, we pass our argument of 3 back in for our integer user choice. So when we click on scissors, our user choice value is always going to be 3. Come down in the code, user choice equals 3, yes it's going to, and then we just compare and see what the computer is going to use. So the computer can either have 1 or 2 as its value, and that's why we don't need an else if, because we know that's the end of what we're checking on. So we can just throw this else down here and show that we win. So now that we have that in there, let's run our program one more time. And scissors, computer 1, so that must mean he picked rock when we picked scissors. It's tie. Let's see if we can click on them all now. Our score goes up as needed. Starting to pull ahead, got a nice little lead. Oh, he's catching us. So that's how we did our method declaration up here. Gave it a access modifier private since we're just using it in this class only. We're not returning anything, so we can give the return type a value of void. Our method name, our identifier, we call determine winner. And again, it's Pascal case, so it's going to be a capital D for determine and a capital W for winner. And we're passing one parameter into it. It's an integer data type, and we're just calling it user choice. And that you can call it any name you want to in there. You just have to use it throughout your code to get it to hold that value. So that's our method declaration. The squiggly brackets after our parentheses here is our method body. That's where we put all of our code at for it. And you can see we got quite a few lines of code here, but we don't have to reuse it anywhere. We can just put these method calls in here, and these are method calls. And down in the button click?
Yeah, because I press scissors, it's a guaranteed player win. That's the thing.
Well, if our scissors comes from our scissors button click down here, and that's why we're using 3, because 1 is rock, 2 is paper, and 3 is scissors. And we're passing this 3 back from this button click for scissors to show that that's what we're clicking or selecting as scissors at this point. So again, like I said, this 3 that we're passing in as an argument for this determine winners in the button scissors goes all the way back up to our method. What it does is when you click on the button, click on this button scissors click event, it goes and finds our method name here, which says determine winner. And then I think if we double click on this, if you hit control down and double click, it'll take us up to where we declare our method at.
Oh, wait.
And so we're saying determine winner, integer user choice. Well, that user choice we put in, that integer was that number 3 that we had down there.
Yeah, but if you don't have an else if, or you don't have like an else if that has like user choice that equals to 3.
Well, that's what all this code is in here. Instead of having to put it down in that button click, we put it all in our method.
Okay, so that int user choice is the value of it is declared when we call the array and put the number in the parentheses.
Well, technically, there's no array. We didn't code for an array or anything. The
Not array. When you call the method, and put the number in the parentheses, then the value of the integer is assigned.
yes, that argument there that we're passing in, when you call the method, with the method call, the value you put in there is technically called an argument. You'll hear it called parameters too. It's kind of interchangeable, but technically it's called an argument. So that we're passing back into the method. Yep.
And if we wanted a second one, we just put a comma and then like int player name or something, and then you can.
Yeah. So if we did a string up top here.
Yeah, I use string a lot.
Yeah, and you can use what you want. It just depends on the situation. If you want to, instead of calling user choice an int, you could call it a string, but then you'd have to wrap everything in parentheses or quotation marks because it's a string. But as Kieran was saying, if we wanted to, we could do a string username here, and then now our method calls down here are angry because we don't have them set up right. So then we could pass in.
And we could theoretically take like an input from like a text box and put it in there instead.
Yeah, yeah. So like I'm calling Mr. G here, and I could do something like, let's see if we can get it to come up here. So now if we get a tie, it should show Mr. G as my username here. Let's put it in all these because now it's not happy. Let me see something real quick. Spell that right, Ian. So it doesn't matter what we call this, as long as it's a string here. That's going to get passed back into this username part. And so now when we run it, the username, if it's a tie, depending on which thing we're using, will come up with our username. So let's try and run this now. And there's a tie here, so we get Mr. G.
Okay.
If we tie it here, we get Matt. Now if we tie in scissors, what should it show up for scissors? We tie on scissors, what's going to come up? We're passing this back as our username, and I'm calling the username when we get to a tie. So what will we expect to see if we choose scissors and we get a tie? What value would we see? Yeah, we'll see Kieran show up. So there's Kieran shows up. So we hit a tie on that part. So that's just kind of how you're passing these arguments back into the method.
Is there like any potential problems that would come from like if you have multiple arguments, but one of them isn't used?
It's not used?
Yeah, like say you declare the first variable
In our method
user choice.
in our method
Declare
signature
user
here?
choice.
You talking our method signature or in our method call?
The one that's next to the when you're declaring a method.
So our parameter in our method declaration.
Hidden declaration, yeah. So say that you use user choice just like you did, but you declare that the string username, but then you don't like use it at all.
So let's,
Would that cause any problems?
oops, Control Z, let's take a look. String username, we're going to change this back to it's a tie. Everything's happy because we're declaring in our method declaration, we want an int and a string pass back. And you can see it's saying remove unused parameter here. And if you go out in the real world, like I said, when I worked for the Department of Defense and we declared things but never used them, there is a chance you could be, yes. And so
Could be what now?
you could be hacked. And so like when I worked for Department of Defense, we ran a code or program, some software that checked for unused variables and possible null pointer exceptions. And we kind of talked about the null pointer kind of thing earlier. But so like if you declare something and you don't use it, you don't want it in your code. You want to try and get rid of it. So we declare it in here, but we're not using it anywhere. So it could end up being a potential issue that could cause something to be hacked. And so if you declare something and you don't use it, you don't really want to keep it in your code. So yeah, we declare.
How would a hacker use an unused variable?
There's a way they can get into the code, and if they can find the unused variable, they can set it to whatever they want to set it to. I'm not a hacker, so I couldn't tell you exactly. But as a developer, that's what we're told, that they use the software to make sure anything that could possibly be hacked got cleaned up and taken out of our code. So how can a hacker use
And I don't
I'm
see,
just trying to get a good feel
Hey,
of what to do and what not to do.
Yep. How
I
can a
don't
hacker
see
use
you
it?
counting rounds yet. Is you gonna nest all of this in the if statement for the round?
What's that?
Is you gonna nest all of this in the if statement for the round?
Nope, that's all we need. So,
I don't see a
well,
round count.
I didn't put a round count in just because I was,
Okay.
yeah, just as an example. But like for each thing, you could put a round count in here and add to it as needed, just kind of like how we did for if somebody wins, it adds to the round count kind of a thing. So we could add to the round count
But
that
you
way.
would need to put it up above if you wanted to stop at 4, right?
Yeah, so we'd have to declare it and check somehow, put another if around it, kind of like what we did. But this was just kind of a quick way to show you how to use methods and stuff like that. So where did I put that round count in here? So that'd be something you have to do. But now to even make this a little more clean, what we could do is we could create another method. And I'll do it right here. Do another method declaration. Method declaration. And we'll call it like computer wins. So we'll do a private since we're using it in our same class, we're going to do a private void, and we'll call it computer wins. And we're not passing any parameters into this. We don't need parameters because all we want to do is when the computer wins, we are going to take this we're going to take all this and throw it up in here. And now instead of having to type each one of these 3 lines out for everything, now we can just say computer wins, and we'll create another one. Private void, since we're not returning anything. Player wins. There's our body again. And these references you'll see above here, it says 0 reference, 1 reference. That's how many times that code is being used in your application. So we put this computer wins down once already right here, so it's showing 1 reference. We just created this player wins. We haven't called it anywhere yet, so it's showing 0 reference. So let's comment this out real quick. And when we start getting into classes, you'll kind of be paying attention to the reference thing here. And this, our determine winner method we created shows 3 references, and that's because we used it each time for each button click. So for each button, we use determine winner method, and so it's referencing it 3 different times in our code. So now we can put player wins. And did I take that and paste it up there yet? Nope. So let's take off that, paste it up in here. And so now we can just go through and we'll say the user wins this one here. And then we can get rid of all this code now. The player wins this one here, so we can put it here and get rid of all this code now. Copy this computer wins. The computer wins this one, so we can get rid of all this code and paste that computer wins in there. Computer wins here, we can get rid of all that code and paste computer wins in there. So now we went from having all that code to now we're using 3 methods, a method called computer wins, a method called player wins, and a method called determine winner. And now you can see how much cleaner, shorter that is. And I think Mr. G's video, he calls it dry. And I can't think of what the...
It's don't repeat yourself.
Yes, there you go. Thank you. Don't repeat yourself. And using these methods and that helps keeping your from repeating yourself, because now we can just, instead of having to repeat these 3 lines 4 or 5 times, all we have to do is call this method call here. 3 or 4 lines of that 4 or 5 times. Now all we do is call this 1 line of code here. And so you can see how large that determine winner was. We'll get rid of this just to show you how clean it does end up getting. I'm keeping it dry. So you can see we went from all that code to using 3 methods and a lot less code than what we needed before. So now if we run this, now let's clean this up and get rid of this username stuff. Again, our method calls aren't happy because we have an extra parameter in there and are passing an argument back we're not using and don't have declared. So I gotta get those out. I'll put a little bit more notes in here real quick. Then you can see our button calls. It's got 1 reference to the button call, 1 reference for each button call from our form. Our player wins, now we're using 1, 2, 3 different times. So if we look up here, our player wins has 3 references listed. So when we create the method, it's called the method declaration. We use this method signature to say what kind of access modifier we want to have, what kind of return data type we want to have, what we want to name our method itself, identify it, and then if we need parameters for it or not. The empty parentheses means, what's that mean? What's empty parentheses next to our?
No parameters.
That's right, we're not passing any parameters back. We don't have to worry about that. If we put something inside the parentheses, that means we're using a parameter. We're going to pass a parameter into our method. And so now we have that. You can see how much more clean that looks, how much nice that looks compared to what we had, and what this looks like over here. How many lines of code we have? We have 180. She used some methods. Where'd you get your methods from? Jamisha, where'd you get your methods from?
What you mean?
On your rock, paper, scissors, just call them methods.
I don't get the question.
I'm giving you a hard time because you're using methods in it before we even studied methods. So.
Oh, I got it. Okay, I get your question. I told you I was doing a code along on YouTube.
Oh, right. Is that where it came from?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can see in Jamisha's code, she was using some methods to get it. Like I said, on a method, when you see a method, if you hit the control button and then go put your cursor over the method, it kind of highlights and underlines. If you click on that, it'll take you to where the method declaration is, and so you can kind of see how the code got wrote. So like if we see this when method declaration or method call here, we can click on it and it'll take us down to the method declaration there. There's our code inside of it.
That's why I was like, when I walked through, it was strings, it wasn't numbers, but the way you did it was way easier than this. So I
Yeah.
don't know why they did that.
It just depends on the developer and what they're trying to show. But hey, so you can see what 221 lines of code kind of thing compared to, is this ours? 221 lines of code to 109 or 108, and that's with a bunch of comments and stuff in here. So that shows you how much you can clean stuff up by using these methods. And the purpose of the reusability of these methods is to keep the stuff short and sweet and clean and dry, don't repeat yourself kind of a thing. So now if we run this, it should work like it did, because all we did was put things in methods to make it cleaner, more reusable. And that there, pretty much in a nutshell, is the purpose of a method, is to make it reusable, make it cleaner, easier to read, less code that you have to write in the long run. So you can see I didn't make it stop at a certain amount. So that pretty much wraps up the purpose of a method, why we use them. Monday I'll go more in depth on these methods and some of the things we can do with them to get really fancy and do some different things with them.